Hello, and welcome to Cell Shaded. This is kind of my first official episode. It's not the first one I've recorded, but is the first one that I'm going to be posting. And, since this is a comics podcast talking about comic news, my thoughts on certain comics, figured I'd like to, give you guys a little peek into my mind and like the kind of things I tend to like. Um, And so, without further ado, I'm Evan Spangler. This is Cell Shaded, and this is a list of my favorite superhero from each decade based on like when they debuted. So I'm not talking about like which hero do I think had a really good run in this decade that I like. Which hero do I think look like design wise look the coolest? I'm just as they go, which does mean that the 60s are a little bloated with honorable mentions. But to start us off, I kind of had to start where I recognized characters, which means the 1930s. And really, there's only two that I could like go like yes, and that of course the honorable mention for this decade is Superman. I like all of the stuff I've read. I read his origin. I've picked up some comics here and there. Superman Birthright, honestly, is like an amazing origin story. Um, if I had to do anything with Superman's origin, that's where I would start. Um, but of course, my favorite from that decade is Batman. I've kind of always liked those, um, darker characters, like not like dark, gritty, like edgy, but like I like those characters that have those. Um, they're like broken, and I like the how Batman, despite being such like a gritty character in such a horrible setting like Gotham, is still like a hopeful character. He represents the chance for change, even if he himself is so stuck in the past that he can't really properly evolve. And I think that's really cool. I've been really loving the absolute Batman stuff. Um, you know, Batman Year One, uh, The Long Halloween. That's all like pretty. I mean, it's basic, but it's basic for a reason. I think it's pretty good. Um, the first comic I ever owned was Batman. I've also got like Under the Red Hood and like that sort of thing. It's just like my vibe. Moving on to the 1940s. This is when superheroes kind of started to explode, but we still didn't get to, you know, quite where I started like really picking up characters, like the characters that exist. I think Dr. Fate is really cool. I haven't read much of him, but I think he's cool, hence why I can't like put him super high up on any list. Wonder Woman, of course, I feel like people would have my head if I left her out. Um, I've been trying to get into her stuff. It's just I gotta find the right jumping off point. But like everything I've seen of her, it's been like pretty good. Dick Grayson, obviously I have to include the original Robin here. I think he's really fun, but not like my favorite Robin. Green Arrow, Oliver Queen. Um, his stuff I always enjoy. Um, it's Batman, but goofier. It also helps that he's sometimes a hometown hero. So, but my favorite from the 40s has to be Captain America. Um, you know, reading old Avengers stuff, he's kind of like the emotional heart of the team. It's him and how am I forgetting his name? Rick Jones. I think their dynamic is really interesting, and as you go on, you see him kind of evolve. His current run is really fun. Um, I just kind of wish they. I feel like they need to get Steve and just to stick his Nomad at this point. Like I feel like having him constantly bounce back and forth between Nomad and Captain America, like you don't even have to like remove the iconography. Take his suit from like Infinity War or something like that, where it's still a much darker color, but you can still see the stars there. I think that they should do that, or go with the classic outfit. I don't mind either which way. The 50s were rather sparse for characters, not as sparse as some of these later decades. Um, but I still have like a standout favorite. This is when really this was DC's Silver Age. Like it's when it started, and it lasted a pretty long time. It's the Bronze. I wouldn't say their Bronze Age really starts until '86 when Crisis on Infinite Earths come out. But we're not gonna talk about that. This is when they exploded. Marvel wasn't around really. On my list, I got Supergirl, and I think she's really cool. Obviously, she wouldn't be on this list otherwise. Uh, I think she takes some of the interesting concepts from Superman and she twists them in a way to make them her own and still has a interesting dynamic with Earth outside of that. I think it's really interesting to see a Superman that had a life on Krypton that he had to leave behind. And it's a different angle to the same kind of like themes and darkness that you see in Superman because it is there. Wally West, he's Kid Flash in the 50s and the 60s, but I really like all of his stuff as the Flash. I think it's really interesting, looking at like his legacy and how down to earth he is. Like, despite the Flash being like I would say one of the more fantastical elements, like surprisingly, one of the like crazier elements of DC, with the Speed Force and everything and how like crazy stupid that is. Um, it's really nice to see how like down to earth Wally is. He really cares about the people around him and his family and all that. Um, it's also interesting to see a more conservative superhero. And also the Absolute Flash stuff I think is pretty cool. Um, but my favorite from the 50s is Hal Jordan Green Lantern. I like most of the Green Lantern stuff, but I've always really liked Hal, especially seeing how um, he's kind of an eternal fuck up. Like that's another thing that you'll see with a lot of the characters that I like is that usually they're hot messes, and Hal definitely is that. Um, he's very rarely on the upswing for like usually if he's on an upswing, it's gonna come down. And I think that's really interesting. Of course, it like folds perfectly into the parallax stuff and all that. Um, But I also just like the Green Lanterns. I like the idea of the Lantern Corps. They have such an interesting power set. It's also really funny seeing like how the weaknesses have evolved. Um, but yeah, the '60s. The '60s is really where there's this big explosion. Um, I think So just going through the list, some of the like characters I find cool, but I haven't like dug super deep into. Um, Qatar Hall. Hawkman, his stuff in the '90s is like my jam. I think that shit is awesome. Um, and also just like the idea of Hawkman is really cool. Um, but and then yeah, no, the '90s Qatar Hall stuff is awesome. Captain Atom, I think he's cool. I think a lot of the stuff out of them is cool. Out of Fox is really cool. Captain Atom, and it'll come up a little later. The question, I think they're sick. The designs really help. The Thing, the Fantastic Four. I'm not like a huge Fantastic Four head. I know of them. I know like the basics. I think they're interesting, but The Thing has always been my jam. For reasons that I've touched on earlier. Um, the first X-Men to show up on this list. He will not be the last. Angel. Angel, I think, is really interesting, especially once you get into the X Factor stuff, and like all the Archangel stuff. I think that's where he like really shines. I think Warren is such a fun character. Um, he's all like this is like fandom stuff, but like if I were to choose a dude for Cyclops to end up with, Angel would be my pick. Um, Like now Wolverine. Wolverine's overdone. Angel is a much more interesting pick, especially if you have the when you consider the dynamic between him and Jean and Scott, you know, I think that's so much more interesting than whatever they do with Wolverine. Daredevil, I really love Matt Murdock. I really love the Daredevil stuff. I'm loving the current run. Some of his older stuff, especially the Frank Miller stuff, is amazing. Man Without Fear and Born Again are awesome. I read both. I have physical copies of both, and they're awesome. Like I've got the collected editions. Black Panther's always cool. You cannot go wrong with Afrofuturism, especially when you like mix in all those different elements. Yeah, no, I think he's just sick. Silver Surfer, again, that really depressing space story I think is really interesting. I've been reading some of his original series; it's pretty good. Yeah, and then Black Bolt, of course. I think he's just such a sick concept. I don't. He's not like I don't even like him for any of the complex. Like just he's so cool. That's all I can say, really. Like his powers, his costume, his like general lore, it's all so sick. But my favorite character from the 60s actually had to be a tie because I couldn't really pick between the two of them. It's Cyclops and Spider-Man, which is pretty easy picks. Spider-Man, no duh. Everyone knows why everyone loves Spider-Man. Um, Cyclops, however, is a little weird because it's definitely gotten better in recent years, but for a while he was like he's just kind of lame and a cuck or whatever. Um, but no, I really do like Cyclops. I've liked him ever since I watched X-Men Evolution. Um, I watched that show as a kid, and so I liked him there, and I picked up the comics, and yeah, no, he's such a fun character. Seeing how he fails to balance his life as Scott and his life as Cyclops is so interesting. And seeing his evolution from Charles's good little soldier to his own person who like guides revolutions is really cool. Um, Especially since he's so like capable and the way his mind works, it also helps that I relate to him a lot. You know, he he struggles so much with like pressure and what he feels is put on him and what he feels his responsibilities are, even if they're not really there. And he often struggles with expressing himself to people, and that's really cool. Um, and I think he's such an interesting leader character. I will always enjoy reading a Cyclops story. The 70s. This is another big year, like decade for Marvel. This is when you start seeing the like B tier stuff, I would say. Some of it. Blade, obviously. I haven't read much of the comics. It's because, yeah, but the movies are sick, especially that first one. Um, except for the weird stuff at the end with his vampire mom, but we can ignore that. Wolverine, no duh. Marvel's Batman, kind of. We'll get there. Colossus, I love Colossus. I think it is so interesting seeing his struggles with being a superhero, along with trying to stick to his beliefs. And this is the same reason why I like Storm and Nightcrawler. Because they all bring such different perspectives, and seeing how they have to shift their preconceived notions of the world in light of their new lives and what they see is really cool. I think it's like honestly, I think the best Colossus stories are the ones where he is struggling with whether he wants to continue being an X-Men or not. Nightcrawler is cool. Uh, I mean, one, I think it's really funny that as soon as he became the lead, he had one mission where he led the X-Men. He messed up a little bit, and instantly he was like, "I should have never taken the job. You should have picked somebody else, Professor." Like it seems like it's a curse that any leader of the X-Men instantly struggles with their self-esteem. But I think it's also really cool seeing how he yearns for the adventure. And how he mixes his Catholic faith with his own lived experience, because in theory they shouldn't be able to mix, but instead he takes the basic teachings of Christ. When you strip away all of the like ceremony, he takes the love thy neighbor and all of that, and he applies it every day. And he's such an interesting character because of it. Storm, I think Storm is at her best not when she is the flawless, uber powerful Omega tier mutant that is unstoppable and just the coolest. She's instead at her best when she's questioning all of that, when she's struggling with whether she wants to be the goddess Storm or the mutant Aurora. And I think her best stories are the ones where she's contending with that, and she like honestly, I do think her powerless era in the 80s was some of the more interesting stuff. Um, because of stuff we'll get to, partially because of stuff that we'll get to, but also just because it's so interesting seeing her navigate one being leader of the mutants, and two, while being not really a mutant. And during one of the rougher arcs, the Marauder stuff is so hard on the X-Men and X Factor to an extent. But yeah, like I think that's just that's where she's at her best, not when she's the coolest girl around. Black Lightning, always cool. His most recent run was awesome. They really need to use him more, especially he's a teacher, and I think that's a really cool job for a superhero to have. And like I want to see more of how he balances that. She-Hulk is always fun and cool, and then the list I had Rhodey coming in at the 80s because of War Machine, but he took over as Iron Man. He's pretty sick. Like, there's no getting around it. He's pretty cool. Um, Iron Man is cool, but I think I like had to include Rhodey because I feel like that's where Iron Man, like he really exemplified Iron Man. Tony's his own thing that I also like. But my favorite from the 70s is Moon Knight, Marvel's other Batman, especially early on, not so much now. Early Moon Knight is interesting because he's definitely more of a Batman guy, but Batman, if he was even worse, mentally, I think it's really interesting. If a little dated, how they explore his DID. His most recent stuff is top tier. I highly recommend it. The art is amazing, especially. But he's just such an interesting concept too. Um, yeah, no, like he's just cool. I don't know what to say. Like just read his stuff. It's amazing. Yeah, no, he's just so interesting, especially the newer stuff. The newer stuff is really where I think it takes off because that's when they started actually exploring the nature of Khonshu, the nature of his DID, how Khonshu interacting with that kind of messes with everything, how he handles being Moon Knight, how the different parts of him handle Moon Knight. I think that's all very interesting. The 80s is where stuff starts to get more sparse. Um, Rogue I think is really cool, and this is actually where I think she's at her best. I don't like modern Rogue as much. I think modern Rogue is so watered down and lame. Like she's still got some of the fight in her. She still like kicks ass and everything, but really I think her most interesting stuff was always the fact that she still had some of her villain tendencies. Um, and like the 80s is where she became a hero, and I think seeing her struggle with her past and those mistakes was really interesting. And it's now she's just become Gambit's wife the same way Gambit has become her husband. And I think there's a lot that we've done there. Jason Todd, my favorite Robin. I love the Red Hood. I love how he challenges Batman and reflects him. And I think what's really interesting is that Jason really is the next coming of Bruce Wayne. He just took a different angle to things. I think it would be really interesting to explore how he would interact as a Batman. It's been done a couple times before. I think they the biggest shame is that nobody's really given him much exploration. Because he's kind of pathetic. He just is. He's not the coolest guy around that you may think he is. He's just as obsessive and broken as Batman, and I would assume to an extent he knows that. Um, because he walked a pretty similar path, except he decided that to stop crime, you had to become the criminal, the biggest criminal to outcompete every other criminal. It's very interesting. She-Ra, I had to throw her up here. She's cool. He-Man's also cool, but She-Ra's just that little bit cooler. But my favorite hero from the 80s, hailing from the post-crisis era, is Booster Gold. One, he fucking every run he fights Superman at least once, which I think is cool. I like that they don't like each other, because Booster Gold is a blowhard, and Superman thinks that he needs to get his head out of his ass. It's great. But I think the really interesting stuff is from Booster Gold's original run, um, which I read the 25 issues, and I also read his stuff in Justice League International, and it's really interesting seeing how yes, he came from the future to become, he's a glory hound at first, it seems, but you can really see that he is somebody who wants to help. He's a hero. I think the best stories are the ones where you can tell that he isn't in it for the money. He genuinely is a good person. It's just underneath the celebrity, you know? I think that's the most fun Booster Gold will ever be. And I think it's kind of a shame where he's been locked up in recent canon. So the 90s. The 90s, it was kind of a big shift in the comic world, especially for Marvel. It's when the speculator bubble crashed. It's also when, um, a bunch of indie comics really started kicking off again because it'd been outside of the big two. There had been some stuff in the early days, like pre superheroes, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and even into the 60s. But after that, they started to really disappear, either because they bankrupted or they were bought out by the other two, mostly DC. 90s is also where we start getting less new characters, more reinventions. Um, but doesn't mean it didn't happen. To start us off with our honorable mentions for the 90s, we have Gambit. Gambit's just cool. What can I say? He also falls in the same thing I'm talking about with Rogue, where now that he really just feels like his whole character is being Rogue's wife, and or not wife, husband, and that would be fine if he wasn't usually also a main character. I can complain about the modern X-Men stuff later. Icon is really cool. It's really interesting seeing. Um, I mean the McDuffie stuff and Milestone Comics is always interesting. It's really interesting seeing a not just a like black Superman, um, but the way that that shapes like his politics. Um, it's interesting seeing a black conservative hero, not just a conservative hero or a black hero. He's not necessarily inherently progressive. If anything, he's pretty regressive with how he's a conformist. Um, but I won't get too much into that. The Thunderbolts, they're not new characters. The team itself did come to existence here, and it's frankly more interesting than most things you'll see because nowadays the Thunderbolts are just kind of the Suicide Squad for Marvel. But back then, it was this whole thing, and I think it's really cool. Honestly, I like the designs a lot better, and the story of the villain's redemption is really cool. My favorite 90s character, I'm basic, it's Spawn. Um, from like the first issue, you can tell that he is the shit. And I can see why he has stuck around for so long. Because he's cool as hell. I really like his story. I like how it handles grief, um, and how really it explores his acceptance that he can't necessarily go back, you know? Um, and I think the weakest points are when they're trying to, have the United Image Comics universe. Um, but that's a whole other story and makes sense why it's like that. For the 2000s, this was a rough year, at first, but it doesn't mean that there weren't still some interesting characters. Honorable mentions: Invincible. I think he's not the cool, like, his story isn't the best. I might get crucified for that, but his story isn't necessarily the best to ever exist. His original comics run is fun. I really do enjoy it. Um, I think the show is interesting. I Yeah, I can't say much else there. Laura Kinney, the current Wolverine, or one of the current Wolverines, because Logan's still doing his thing. Um, I mean, she's really cool. Cool. I also think it's cool that she came from X Men Evolution, like, and then she stuck around, and she's really evolved, and it's really cool to see. Kate Kane, Batwoman. Um, Again, I really like the different take on Batman. She's also a hot mess, which I think is, it's like one of my favorite character traits. The eternal fuck up, who still like pulls through at the end of the day to do good. I think that's really cool. But my favorite hero from the 2000s is Sentry. Oh my god, do I love Sentry. And no, it's not just for power scaling reasons, though. If you get into that, you're fucked. Because Sentry's kind of bullshit, and so we should just ignore him. But his original run is really cool. I like how he's tied in to the wider Marvel universe. Um, there's a one shot where Archangel was reflecting on their past interactions with Sentry, and I think that was really cool. In the most recent series, it's a really interesting way to look at grief. I think the ending's a little rushed, but it is what it is. Um, you know, I also think what they did with him in the MCU is kind of interesting. So yeah, he's one of my favorite characters. Um, yeah, and in the 2010s, really nothing new here. There's not a lot of new characters that I have found interesting, that I have read. They just aren't making a lot of new ones. Um, I don't even have the 2020s on here. One, because I mean, we're almost over halfway through, and there's really not that many new characters. Um, but for the 2010s, honorable mention Kamala Khan. I think she's fun. I think she's the perfect way to adapt a internet age hero, and like not like adapt, but like, you know what I mean. You know, Especially one that is in such an established universe as Marvel. Um, and then of course, my favorite is Miles Morales. Again, he's a character that I enjoy how he handles pressure and the pressure of being a legacy hero. It's also just cool. I mean, it's Spider-Man, so like kind of hard to be not cool and Spider-Man. But you know, it is what it is. I don't know why I said that, but yeah, Miles is cool. I think he is uh one of the better characters on this list too, especially for a character that hasn't been around for that long. I think he's a really worthy successor to Spider-Man, and honestly, I wouldn't be um remiss if he took over the main Spider-Man stuff. But yeah, that was my get to know me kind of thing. Get to know the kind of things I like when looking at the comics. Um, Feel free to tell me your favorite characters. If you agreed with anything I said, if you want to suggest things to me, um, if you disagree with anything I said. Um, but yeah, you can do that all in the comments. If you want to see more of this, fucking subscribe. You know how to do this. But yeah, This has been Cell Shaded. I'm Evan Spangler, and thank you for listening.